Right, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, getting back into our series, The Meaning of Life. And this great book found here in the Old Testament under the wisdom books. King Solomon himself wrote this, refers to himself as the preacher 1,000+ years before the church age began. And yet Ecclesiastes is a derivative, that term, of ecclesia, which is the Greek term for church. And the church, not a building, but the people of God. And so this is the king seeing himself as a preacher, delivering a sermon to the people. My mom liked to paint. And so she painted a lot of paintings in her day, a lot of scenery, mountains, and those types of things. And so there was one in particular that I really liked. And so I was trying to bond with my mom, and I had a spring break, and I said, teach me how to paint this picture. Well, that was a big mistake, I tell you. Nothing against my mom at all, but I just thought, oh yeah, you just kind of whip it up. She made it look easy. You just kind of do it, and bam, there's this awesome painting. And some of you have tried that, especially oil painting. I realized really quick that was not my gift, nor did I want to pursue anything like that. Though it's fun to be creative, and that was some great bonding, and yet, at least it kind of was for me. I'm not sure if it was for her because I was a difficult subject, but it was frustrating, right? Because during the process, it didn't look like the final product. It looked far from the final product, and I would get frustrated. This doesn't look right. This isn't what it looks like. And she would say, be patient. You know, you got to kind of let it go here, and there's no mistakes. And if you ever watched the guy with the fro, there's no mistakes, or I don't know, whatever. She'd been watching him or something. There's no mistakes and all that. I'm like, no, it's a total mistake. And it was so frustrating. Finally got it done, and you know what? It looked like the painting that I liked. It just kind of all came together, and all the pieces and all the strokes and the strokes that I was having and all of that, it all came together. Now, it's the same thing with cake, too. You're baking cake. Does anybody like flour? You ever get a big spoonful of flour and go, love that flour. It's so good. I've never seen that. We might, take some of the chocolate chips or peanut butter if that's part of it, but nobody takes a big spoonful of flour and goes, ooh, this is tasty. And yet, what happens when you add all those ingredients, out of the oven pops this glorious thing that you eat and tastes delicious. Well, more important than paintings and cake, life, we face a similar process. It can be frustrating. It can be like eating flour. It can be like you're looking at what you're trying to do and it looks far from what you're trying to do. But there's a process. And as Christians, we are called to try and understand and place our faith in God in this process. And that is one of the hardest things to do. Because sometimes we hear the gospel call, come to Jesus, have your sins forgiven, and go to heaven one day. And that is incredibly true. And yet, there are a lot of steps until we get to that place. And it can be very frustrating until that place. Why? Because life can be frustrating. There's a big picture that is going on. And then there's the personal picture of our lives and how it fits into this big picture. So as Christians, then we are called upon through Scripture to trust in God in this process. And that's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. We trust that God is in control, that He has a purpose, and yet the process can be incredibly difficult. Oh, we love Romans 8:28, and we should. What an incredible promise, right? Some of you committed that to memory. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to His purpose. We kind of like the first part of that, but then there's that to His purpose. And that's where that tension begins. We are called upon to believe that. Do you believe those verses today? Those are our bread and butter, bread and water for day-to-day living. Good isn't always easy. He works all things together for good for those who love Him. And yet good isn't always easy. In fact, it's often quite the opposite. Because it goes against our natural bent, our natural nature, which has been marred and tainted and corrupted by sin. And so there's a power struggle that we face from the moment we come to faith in Christ until we go and be with him, there is that tension. Another word for that tension is the sanctification process. We are saved, we are justified, declared not guilty, and declared righteous on the day of salvation. And yet, we are then catching up to what we are legally in the day-to-day life, becoming more and more like Christ is another way of saying it. And that's where that tension comes to be. So then, as we look at life then, we find that it's often not fair. It can be filled with trouble. It can be filled with pain. It can be filled with inequity and injustice. And we cry out in those moments, is there any hope? Why bother? I came to Jesus. I thought he was going to make everything rosy. And the opposite has happened. My family's rejected me. It's difficult. I'm trying to do what's right at work. And there's these jerks who are going up the corporate rung ahead of me, and I'm trying to do it right. They're cheating. They're ripping people. They're stepping on people. Life's not fair. All my dreams haven't come true. Is there hope? Yes. Solomon addresses this pain that we receive in the process in a very distinct way here in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Probably one of the most familiar passages in all of the Old Testament. In fact, songs have been sung about this. What would you tell a person who is in deep despair, who's doubting, who's in trouble? They might be a Christian. They might not be a Christian. We have Solomon here as the preacher, reflections on a misspent life, on a life pursuing meaning and purpose apart from God, having no limits in that process and in that journey towards trying to find meaning. So these are very wise, sound words, and he gives some incredible observations, and he does that right here in Ecclesiastes 3. And our main point as we look at this today is how, in trying to connect the troubles that we experience to a God who is sovereign, to a God who is good, to a God who is loving. Isn't that one of the biggest questions, especially the doubters might have? Is how could a loving God, and then fill in the blank. How could a good God fill in the blank? I can't believe in a God who would allow blank to happen. You fill in the blank. We could spend all days filling in those blanks. Well, Solomon tells us. And it's so hopeful. And yet it's not easy as well. So our main point today is this. Time is the invention of God for measuring the unfolding of his plan and for his glory. Time. What is time? You think about time and how unique it is. We have clocks that measure our time. Years, decades, millennia, they go on, centuries. And we measure this. Why do we measure this? Why has God created this measurement? Well, it reveals the unfolding of his plan. And ultimately, it's for his glory. All that he does is for his glory. Chapter 1, we saw as Solomon observed nature and some of the basics of life that there's established cycles. And at that time, as he was talking about these cycles, the sun comes up, the sun goes down, the winds blow, the waters come and go. There are these cycles of life. Do they have any purpose? Well, he begins to show us in Ecclesiastes 3 that it does. We looked last week, 2 weeks ago, at chapter 2, which is his pursuit of living in the fast lane. We kind of used this driving illustration. He took hedonism and materialism for a test drive. Hedonism is pleasure seeking, and materialism. He amassed great things, great projects, great treasures. He just went headlong into incredible pleasures, and it left him cold, dark, empty. So he went down a familiar road. He had looked at wisdom in the first chapter and found that there was nothing helpful in that. Then he went back to wisdom. Well, let me check it again now that I've gone down this road. Let me go back to wisdom and kind of look at it again. And he said, well, it's definitely better to be wise than stupid. That's a definite plus in life. And yet, the wise man and the fool both die. So ultimately, when it comes to the ultimate meaning in life, wisdom can't help you unless that wisdom, as he tells us in Proverbs, leads to the fear of God. Then he talks about toil again. We see toil show up again here. He's trying to put the pieces together. We work hard To what purpose? And it's frustrating. And then finally there's a glimmer of light in chapter 2, verses 24 and on. There is nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? And there's the key. That's the first little light, glimmer of light in this book, in those first 2 chapters, where he's putting the pieces together. I've done all this apart from God. With God, there can be enjoyment in the toil and the difficulties of life. There can be hope. For the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting only to give to the one who pleases God. This also is fleeting vanity. Now we get to chapter 3. These first 15 verses say this. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. What gain has the worker from this toil? There's that recurring question he asks. And I've seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's hearts, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive there is nothing better for them to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all this toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. All right, strap in. Buckle down. Here we go. We're going to take a look, first of all, the problem with what time reveals. As time reveals and time marches on, it gives us a revelation of sorts. And what we find is that as we look at it, especially from an under-the-sun perspective, apart from God, there's trouble. But even with God in the foreground or in the background, either way, there's still trouble. Okay, if God is who he says he is, boy, there's some head-scratching things going on. How do we make sense of these? And Solomon starts off with a very hopeful statement. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. That's pretty inclusive. Nothing random. There's nothing pointless. Nothing happens outside of God's control. Now, that doesn't mean that everything God approves of that happens. That doesn't mean that it's okay, obviously. Adam and Eve's sin happened under God's watch. Why did he allow that to happen? Well, the answer to any of those questions is always for his glory to be revealed. And that's what's taking place here. What Solomon is doing, pointing to time, is that time reveals God's glory. And yet as we look and observe time, there's some things that happen. Good and bad. God is not out of control in those situations. And he doesn't approve of everything that happens. And yet, because he is in control of it all, we need not fear or give up hope. It says there's a time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. There's a purpose to life and death. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. Some of those are hard realities. Go, wait a minute, killing. A time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up. These are extremes. And with these extremes come great emotions when we take a look at them and we experience them. Verse 4, a time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. Life is filled with phone calls that leave us either heartbroken or glad. Get the phone call from the doctor and it's not the news that we were looking for. We get a phone call, maybe from somebody, hey, we're expecting. Hey, this is exciting. We get the same phone call that says, oh, we've miscarried. Look at these extremes. Sometimes we fear the phone to ring. And yet, they're filled with both sides of that. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Verse 5, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. There's saving, there's spending, there's building, there's relationships coming and going. Verse 6 is the theology of garage sales. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. Right? Verse 7, a time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silent and a time to speak. That idea of tearing garments in grief and repentance. There's a time to tear in grief. There's a time to tear in repentance. There's time to sow, time to mend, repair, heal, find hope. Verse 8, a time to love and a time to hate. Now, what is it, a time to hate? It's okay to hate things like injustice and human trafficking and racism and the slaughter of innocents. In other words, sin. It's okay to hate sin. The problem is we like it. We pick on the sins that we don't like to make us feel about the sins that we do like. Time for war and a time for peace. Well, we don't like to hear that, and yet it's part of planet Earth. It's not just the polar opposites that are being talked about here, but that's including everything that's in between these things, these extremes. Now, you may have not have experienced everything that's on this list, but it's a general description of what humans experience. So maybe some of you have looked at it and go, yep, every single one of those. Both sides of that list, the left and the right, I've experienced. Now here's what Solomon is saying here. All times are appointed. They have their place. They have their meaning. And oftentimes you can't avoid either. Both happen. So if you're more cynical or disillusioned, I want to tell you there is a time to dance. There is a time to laugh. There is a time to heal. There's a time to love. To the naive that are out there, there is a time to cry. There is a time to give up. There's a time to scatter, refrain, and a time to hate. When is that time? That's where we beg for wisdom. Lord, in this moment, am I supposed to laugh or am I supposed to weep? Most of the time, it's pretty obvious. But a lot of us, when is it time? Should I cast these away or should I gather them in? Is this a time to embrace or a time to refrain from embracing? This is when we call out to God. In James chapter 1, it says, if you lack wisdom, call on Him. He will give you wisdom. This is an area where we need wisdom. But verse 9 then asks that question in light of this. An honest question. What's the point? What do we gain? What do we gain from work from His toil? We go through these seasons of times. These different times hit us, sometimes simultaneously. What's the point? Well, these are like smelling salts. They keep us from fainting. We realize this, and this is hard to swallow as we look at this in light of God and His plan in this, is that we are not God. That's obvious. Thanks, Pastor. That's super obvious. And yet that's not how we live, right? Also, we want God in a box. We want Him to behave. We want to be able to control Him and control our circumstances. And the reality is this, that God is not a genie. He is not a fairy godmother. He's not an ATM machine. Turn to Isaiah, if you will. To the right. If you're in paper Bible, scroll to it. If you have an electronic one. Isaiah chapter 46, verses 5 through 10. This gives a different picture to us. God is not our genie or even a nice old grandpa who sits on the porch of heaven in his rocking chair wouldn't give lollipops to his grandkids. My grandpa didn't do that, but maybe yours did. I don't know. Isaiah chapter 46, verses 5 to 10 says this, "To whom will you liken me and make me equal?" This is God speaking through the prophet Isaiah. "And compare me that we may be alike. Those who lavish gold from the purse and weigh out silver in the scales hire a goldsmith, and he makes it into a god. Then they fall down and worship. They lift it to their shoulders. They carry it. They set it in its place, and it stands there. It cannot move from its place. If one cries to it, it does not answer or save him from his trouble. Remember this and stand firm. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose." Wow. This is who God is. He's not an idol. He is not powerless. He's not a genie or a fairy godmother. This is who God is. Turn to Acts chapter 17. He reminds his people in Acts 17, verses 24 through 25. This is Paul addressing the Areopagus in that famous speech that he says to the philosophers and to the idolaters there in Athens. He says these: "The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man." You think, well, what about that temple that they had in Israel? That was a reminder to them that God's presence was there. He was not contained there, stuck there between those four walls. "Nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." Now, we say things like we serve God, but it's not because God needs a little help. It's because he's our Lord and our Master. Again, this is the picture. We kind of want God, but we don't want this God. We want our way. We want it nice and tidy. Look at verse 10. He says, "I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with." That idea of worker in verse 9 is actually someone with a heavy burden, a sufferer, sorrowful. And the business there is occupation. It says to be busy with, which means to be burdened, afflicted, and humbled. To put it all together, as it says there, life feels like a burden. You work at life, you experience these things, and it feels heavy. And we try to make sense of it. And it's burdensome to us. Some of you, maybe this last week, you just wanted to fall on the couch and stay there for about 2 months. I get that feeling. I understand that feeling. But here's a new wake-up. Here's a new question to ask ourselves. How do we live in a world that we can't control? This is what Solomon is getting at here. How do we live in a world that we can't control? Oh, it frustrates us. As we look from our little moment in time and we figure out what it reveals that we're not God and we're not happy about it. It's frustrating to us. And so then we're filled with whys. Why is there a time for everything? I like half of that list. I don't like the other half of that list. Why doesn't God just make it right now? Boom. Just make it right. Well, we have the promises of God that he will one day. But until then, time marches on with his unfolding plan, revealing his glory each step of the way. Don't leave yet. There's more verses. Remember, don't leave. If you get to a point where you're like, whew, this is heavy. It's meant to. Solomon is not mincing words. That's what's so beautiful about Ecclesiastes. He's not playing footsie here. He's not sugarcoating anything, and yet what comes through it is marvelous truth that brings us to understanding of what is real, what is good, and who God truly is, which is so much better than the one that we could make up and create. Even if we don't fashion them out of gold, we fashion them in our own minds and into our own image. which does us no good. I'm a lousy God. I find that out every day when I try to be Him. And it just doesn't work. And I get frustrated instead of looking to Him. So let's respond to what time reveals. What do we do as we realize, wow, there's two sides of this list and everything in between. And what does it reveal here? And there's 4 truths we want to look at in the time that we have and what it reveals to us. And it gives clarity to God's plan and His glory. And the first one is this. We find this in verse 11 as it leads up to these beautiful words. Except that God's plans are beautiful. I think I have a quote here from Pastor Tom Nelson's pastor at Denton Bible Church. In his book, Problem of Life with God. This should be a title for you. On the book of Ecclesiastes. He says this. Solomon says that however we try to resolve the fact that evil exists and that God is good, we can't do it by saying that God is not in control. It's important to understand, and it's what Solomon is saying here, is that yes, there is evil everywhere we look. That does not mean that God is not in control. Some have tried to kind of mesh it back in and say, okay, there's evil. God's supposed to be in control. Well, maybe what might help us understand is that God's not as in control as we think He is. There are those who perpetrated that from the beginning. That God is more limited. Yeah, He's God, but what happens then is that we turn God into a small g God. He starts to look more like a demigod or a partial God. Or, yeah, He's bigger than us, but not quite as big as we thought Him to be. That's the way we explain evil. No, that provides no comfort. And that's not what the Bible tells us. That's not what Solomon is telling us here. Instead, he says this. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Only God can take things that are evil and make them beautiful in time without condoning the evil that they are. Yes, amen to that. That is good news, people. A creator. And there's a process to it. And here's the problem. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Which means not our time, not my time, not your time, its time, which really means His time. He's in control of that. And that's actually a good thing. God reveals His infinite power and ability when He takes things that were intended for evil and He makes them turn into something good. It's the piano here. What if it only had white keys on it? It would be really bland. If we played a song and I can't play a song, if I had one of you that plays keyboard just play white keys, it would be bland. If you only played the black keys, it would kind of be a little strident. But together, what do? They make beautiful music. Both sides of this list that he's listed here make beautiful music, but it can only happen because God is an artist and an orchestrator of these things to make it beautiful. Yeah, have you ever come back to a place in hindsight where you've seen something bad that had happened to you and then you end up saying, oh, that was the best thing that could have happened to me. That time I went to prison, man, that was the best thing that could have happened to me. That time where these certain events happened in my life where I got this, even something like cancer. Isn't it amazing to hear when someone says, when I had cancer, it was the best thing that happened to me? How? God's in control. And God makes it beautiful in its time. That doesn't mean He likes cancer or He thinks it's fun. Cancer is a result because this world broke because of sin. And all those other horrible things are a result because sin broke this world. And yet God wasn't deterred or thrown for a loop. Instead, He then shows how amazing He is when He takes evil, horrible things and He turns them into good. If there wasn't sin and evil in this world, how would we know how to value holiness, love, heroism, patience, the depth of His attributes, if we haven't seen the opposite of those things. That's why we understand the good news of the gospel, because we understand the bad news. We talk about a thing called hell, not because we want to focus all our energy on that and how bad that is, but it helps us understand then how good it is that God takes people who deserve that horrible thing and He saves them, and He does so at the expense and cost of His own Son's blood. How do we know how great His grace and His love is? Because of the opposite of that we've experienced, that we've seen in ourselves and in other people. What made those firemen and policemen in New York City on September 11, 2001 look so heroic? Because there were horrible people who took planes and crashed them into burnt buildings, causing 3,000 plus to die. We see a contrast there. We see the horrible after effects of things like Harvey and the other extremes that we've seen in the hurricanes, and yet we see especially even Christians who are doing amazing things, that are displaying the kindness and love of God in the midst of these catastrophes. Why do we think a Ferrari or a Lamborghini is so cool? Because we've seen a Pinto. We've seen a Pacer. We've seen the opposite of that, right? And so we go, wow, that's a cool car. What makes that? I don't know. But you look at it and go, that's pretty cool. And you look at another and you go, well, it'll get you there. And that's ultimately the point. And that's why most of us afford Pintos and not Lamborghinis. Okay? Why does a hit in baseball, those of you who play baseball or softball, when you get a hit, especially a home run, there's nothing that feels better. Why? Because you struck out, and nothing feels worse. Chocolate is so delicious because God allowed okra to be made. Nature's snot that people try to boil and go, oh, it's yummy. And some of you like, some of my family, I'm thrown under the bus here, and I'm sorry. They go, oh, but okra is so good. Now, none of them would say it's better than chocolate, but you get the idea. Maybe you pick your worst thing. Actually, okra is not the worst thing I can think of. I'm not going to tell you because some of you will give it to me as a joke, and I don't want it, all right? But that's why chocolate tastes chocolate, or steak, or whatever it is that you find a treat. It's because the opposite end. Gruel. Why did I go through some bad dates in my life? So that when Lisa came and I went out with her, I went, oh, this is what it's all about. Wow. What's the reality check? God has plans, and they are wise despite our opinion. God does not have a suggestion box. In the temple, when you look at the maps and the cool 3D images of the temple, you notice that there by the showbread isn't a little box that says, you got any ideas, people? What would you like? How would you like this to be done? No, God says, I will tell you how it's done. I will actually tell you what your true needs are. We'll all come in with this is what I need. No, God says, no, it's way worse. You need more than that. He does not have an opinion or a suggestion box. How about the story of Joseph? This is just a classic case. Joseph was sold down the river, so to speak, by his 11 older brothers. The people you're supposed to count on to protect you, threw you in a ditch and sold you as a slave. You end up getting a job. You work for a really great guy. His wife hits on you. You run out of the house. Then you get thrown in prison for that. Then what happens? One day you end up being second in charge next to Pharaoh. Your brothers come groveling back. They don't recognize you. And what does he say? You intended evil for me. God intended good. Genesis 50, 19 through 20. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for I am in the place of God. Meaning, God has me where He has me. As for you, you meant it evil. But God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Before you shake your fist at God, know that the picture isn't done yet. It's not complete yet. There's a process. You may not like the process, or you may not like the answer when you ask God, but know that God always answers in a way that magnifies His glory, and whatever is most glorifying to Him is what's best for us. Number one, accept that God's plans are beautiful because they are. Number two, accept that God's plans are mysterious. Some of this isn't going to make sense. Are you okay with that? There is a mystery. Yet there's a grand and epic story that is going on. We get the big picture in Scripture. We know how this ends. We know the promises of God. And yet there are some details that are left out. We don't like that. It says here in the second part of verse 11, also he has put eternity into man's hearts, and yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. There is an inquisitive nature about us. We have a thirst for understanding and knowledge with a naturally built-in button that indicates that something bigger is at play, and yet we may not be able to put it all together. We ask those questions. Why was I born this way? Why did God give me the family that He gave me? Why do I have this sickness? Is there a purpose to this, or is this just random badness that happens? Am I unlucky? There's a button in this too that says, I want to know. I want to know the answer to this. And here's God's answer oftentimes. I'm not always going to tell you. You're just going to have to trust me. Isaiah 55:8 reminds us that His ways and thoughts aren't ours. His ways are higher. We don't see the big picture like He does. We don't see all the details that He does. We don't see how they all fit together. In other words, it's kind of like He's saying this. In life, there's going to be some troublesome things for you. But I'm wise. You're going to want to know, and I'm not going to tell you. You're just going to have to trust me. That's what deepens our trust in Him. As humans, we're so prideful and so arrogant. If we can't figure out this thing, we take our toys and go home. Fine, I'm just going to take my time. I'm going to take my time. I'm going to take my choices. I'm going to do what I want because I've done it the right way and it hasn't got me anything. You know, we couldn't write in cursive until age 8. In fact, many of us can't. I still can't write in cursive. We could read it. I couldn't drive legally until I was 16. We discovered that there's ice on Mars in the last couple hundred years. Boy, aren't we smart. God's like, yeah, I put it there a long time ago. We want to give our advice to God. Oh, so many times I've done funerals, or I've talked to people that say, oh, when I get there, I'm going to tell God a few things. No, you're not. Stop it. What kind of craziness is that? The truth is, there are things in your life 10 to 20 years removed, maybe 30 or 40, and you still go, I don't know what that was all about. How about, my mom died of cancer, and she said to me in that last year of her life, I didn't plan for this. And I know what she means. Like, nobody plans for that. Why did it happen? Because everything is beautiful in its time. In its time. It may not be until we face God. We're so ready to put God on trial, forgetting that the left side of this list is all a result of sin. Choices that men and women make. Job, encountering his questions to God, God began to remind him, were you there when I made grasshoppers? And so on. There's a huge list towards the end of the book of Job. And what does Job finally reply? I'm just going to put my hand on my mouth. It's better that I shut up. Because, yeah, I get it. You're God. I'm not. And guess what? Job never got an answer. His life got restored in a marvelous way because he didn't give up his faith. And yet, at the end of the day, God didn't say, here's why, Job. Instead, he just declared his greatness. Isaiah, what did he do? He gets an appearance of God, and he says, God, I got a few things to tell you. No, he falls flat on his face and says, I'm a man of unclean lips. This is the prophet of God saying this. Oh, wretched man that I am. Now, I'm not trying to be insensitive to her. Just reminding us the mystery. And it's not calling us to the opposite of trust. 2 Corinthians 4:16, I quoted this before. Paul says this, we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction. Are you kidding me, Paul? What? This is a man saying this who was beaten to the point of death, snake bitten, shipwrecked. You didn't want to be around Paul. You'd think he was the unluckiest man in the world. And yet, here's what he says. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the other things that we are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient. They're passing. But the things that are unseen are eternal. Many of us say things like, well, I have to see to believe. Can you see your brain? Do you want to see your brain? I don't. I still don't know how TV... do you know, some people don't know this. I have a TV degree. A radio TV degree. I still don't understand how TV works. And yet, guess what? I turn it on, and there's the game. There's the things I want to see on there. Some things I don't. God has put this vast desire for meaning in us. We are made for eternity. Yet in this mortal body, we will find not all the answers. Yet we have the one who does. And that's the point that Solomon is getting at here. Trust him. It deepens our faith. We rely on God knowing that he really does make everything beautiful in its time. It's time, not your time. And that leads to number 3. We accept that God's plans are mysterious. That we may go, I don't get it. And God says, that's okay. I do. Trust me. Number 3, accept that God's plans are meaningful. Well, how do you get meaningful from this? The fact that he says there is a time for this means that there is meaning to that time. Solomon is reminding us that they all have their meaning and purpose. Life is not in vain. Our reaction is to be bitter or to give up. Why bother? Yet Solomon gives us hope. And here's what he says. Do not let what you can't control destroy what you can enjoy. Let me say that again. It's kind of a heavy thought. Do not let what you can't control destroy what you can enjoy. We try to jockey with God for his position, not realizing that's why we're miserable. To enjoy life, you must let God be God. Yes, those questions of why come to us. And here's the answer. You're not God. That should give us relief. When we give up trying to be God, we can rest that he is and that he's got it in control in this sense. And I'm not trying to give a cliche here. We don't have to give up and be cynical. We see verse 12, I perceive that there is nothing better for them, for us, than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. There is pleasure in work. Why bring this up? He said, what's the gain? God has blessed you. Work hard. It's an opportunity to glorify him. Until you get that phone call that changes everything. Enjoy life. See it as a gift from God. Let me say this again. Don't let what you can't control destroy what you can enjoy. So then we accept God's plans are beautiful, mysterious, meaningful, and lastly, putting them all together, number 4, we accept that God's plans are trustworthy. Right? That should be obvious. I've already mentioned it from time, but here we find this. God's control isn't to trouble us, but to comfort us. That's the point of this. Rather than being sent for a tailspin when trouble hits a believer. I've had my share of tailspins. Instead, we're supposed to dig in. And if we dig in and we trust him, we will have no regrets. When my mom died of cancer, other things that have happened, when those have happened, the only thing that gives me comfort in that is that God is in control of that. Not cancer. Cancer's not in control. Illness is not in control. Murderers are not in control. Terrorists are not in control. The government is not in control. North Korea is not in control. All the different factions and organizations, the Democrats, the Republicans, those in between, those who aren't, communists, socialists, they're not in control. Oh, they may make choices that they have to pay for, all of us, unless Christ has paid for them for you. Here's the comfort, knowing that everything, then, is not senseless, pointless, or meaningless. That everything under the sun answers to the God above it. That's the hope that we have. Verse 14, I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before Him. Or at least that's supposed to be the result of that. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. Solomon's gift of wisdom is starting to kick in now for him here in chapter 3. There's nothing to add to this. God is not short-sighted, and He doesn't go, oh, I didn't think of that. Oh man, what was I? Oh, I shouldn't have done that. Nothing to take away. God has no red pen. He goes, whoops, I've got some mistakes here. Let's cover it with a little red pen. Didn't you hate that when you get the text back and you go, here's all this red pen of everything that you did wrong. So what does this say of God? If you're being honest, who is more trustworthy then? You or Him? Me or Him? It's so that we fear God. We have a reverent trust. Not that we're fist waving at God. God, why are you doing this? The answer is because I love you, because I'm in control, I have a plan. I'm not going to always tell you about everything asked. You might figure it out tomorrow what the plan was for today. But what that does then is point you to the fact that I can be trusted. You can't be trusted. And take heart, He's not always pleased. Verse 15 reminds us, everything's on schedule. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. Everything's on schedule. Past, future are running according to plan. Take heart. He's not always pleased, but He's never perplexed or surprised by it. Time is lost to us. Time is not lost to Him. God seeks what has been driven away. We can't figure it out. We can't put it together. We just can't gather everything together. He does. He's not a puppet master. But God can really make everything beautiful in its own time. And here's the number one proof as we kind of close things down. God took the most awful thing and made it the most glorious one, did He not? How about Acts 2:23? This Jesus, as Peter claims to the people and preaches to the people in Acts chapter 2, this Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. God's idea. And yet, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. You are responsible for Jesus going into the hands of the Romans to nail Him to a cross. And yet, it was God's definite plan and foreknowledge. So what you have here is God's plan. Jesus was always supposed to go to the cross. Before the foundation of the world, they had this figured out. And yet, those who drove the nails in, those who made false accusations against Him, who were in the crowd that Peter was preaching to, some of the Sanhedrin, the leaders of the Jewish people, who were threatened by His calling Himself Messiah, God's Son, put Him there. They're accountable for their actions, and yet this was God's plan. And so then we sing songs like The Old Rugged Cross. It's kind of a weird song, really. We're commemorating an execution device. But because something glorious happened there. Aren't you glad for the cross? Is it not the greatest of news that God has saved us by the giving of His Son? And yet it's the most horrible thing. Mankind, His creation, put God on the cross to kill Him. That's what we think of God. And yet here we are singing the glories of the cross, as we should. The most worst thing became the best thing. All because God makes everything beautiful in its time. The perfect person, sinless, the God-man, hung on a cross. And we are thankful for it. If He could do that with the cross, what about your life? As He tells you, take up your cross and follow me. And you might find more things on the left side in your life than the right side of this time to chart. But He will say, yes, take up your cross and follow me. But after the cross, remember there was a resurrection. You take up your cross, you follow me, there will be resurrection for you. Life with me for eternity. That is what time is pointing to. That is the great beauty. So you may find yourself frustrated at this painting called life. It's a process. That painting is not done yet. In fact, it won't be until you go and see him, until he calls you home.